Hello everybody and welcome back to Law and Court Cases. I want to start by saying sorry because there wasn't a video last week, but I'm back to my regular schedule now and we're back to discussing another case. Today's video I'm actually covering another unsolved case. 3 men escaped from a prison in the dead of night using secret tunnels they managed to dig and a makeshift boat that they pulled together using coats. They made it to the water, but did they make it to the mainland, or were they lost forever? Today, we are talking about the escape from Alcatraz. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. Alcatraz Island is a small island offshore of San Francisco, California in the United States. The island was developed in the mid-19th century with facilities for a lighthouse, a military fortification, and a military prison. It wasn't until 1934, though, that the island was converted into a federal prison, called Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The strong currents around the island and the cold temperatures made escapes nearly impossible, and the prison became one of the most notorious in American history. It closed its doors in 1963 as a prison, but now stands as a major tourist attraction. During its time as a prison, 14 separate escape attempts involving 36 inmates took place, but only one was known to be successful. Or was it? In June of 1962, 3 inmates escaped from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Before I get into the story, I'm going to talk about them a little bit so we know the players in this game. Starting off with Frank Lee Morris, who was born on September 1st in 1926 in Washington, D.C. Sadly, by the age of 11 he was already an orphan and spent much of his childhood in foster homes. He caught his first criminal offence at the age of just 13, and by his late teens had been arrested from crimes from narcotics possession and armed robbery. Most of his early years were spent in jail serving lunch to prisoners, before later being arrested for grand larceny in Miami Beach, car theft, and armed robbery. It's reported that Morris was extremely intelligent, measuring with an IQ score of 133. He served time in both Florida and Georgia, then escaped from the Louisiana State Penitentiary while serving a 10-year sentence for bank robbery. He was recaptured, however, just a year later and was sent to Alcatraz on January 20th of 1960. His inmate number was AZ-1441. Now, moving on to the Anglin brothers. John William Anglin, born on May 2nd of 1930, and Clarence Anglin, born May 11th of 1931, were born into a family of 14 children. Their parents, George Robert Anglin and Rachel Van Miller Anglin, were seasonal farmers in the early 1940s. They moved the family to Ruskin, Florida, in the hopes of sustaining a more reliable source of income. It's reported that Clarence and John were inseparable as children, essentially 2 peas in a pod. They became skilled swimmers and amazed their siblings by swimming in the frigid waters of Lake Michigan, as ice still floated on its surface. But they were troublemakers. Clarence was first caught breaking into a service station when he was just 14 years old. The brothers began robbing banks and other establishments as a team in the early 1950s, usually targeting businesses that were closed to ensure that no one got injured. They claimed they only used a weapon once during a bank heist, although it wasn't really a weapon, because it was a toy gun. On January 17th of 1958, brothers John and Clarence, as well as their other brother Alfred Anglin, robbed the Bank of Columbia in Columbia, Alabama. All 3 received 35-year prison sentences. They served originally at Florida State Prison, and then Atlanta Penitentiary. After repeated attempts to escape from the Atlanta facility, John and Clarence were transferred to Alcatraz. John arrived on October 24th of 1960 and was given the inmate number AZ-1476, and Clarence arrived on January 16th of 1961 as inmate AZ-1485. There is in fact another player in this game, even though he did not make it out of the prison. His name was Alan West. He was born on March 25th of 1929 and was born in New York City. West was arrested over 20 times throughout his lifetime. He was imprisoned for car theft in 1955, first at Atlanta Penitentiary and then at Florida State Prison. After an escape attempt from the Florida facility, he was transferred to Alcatraz as well in 1957 at the age of just 28. He became inmate AZ-1335. You may ask, how is it that these 4 people became connected? Obviously the Anglin brothers were related, but what about West, and what about Morris? Well, the 4 inmates all knew each other from previous incarcerations in both Florida and Georgia. They were assigned adjacent cells in December of 1961, and it was from there that they began formulating an escape plan under the leadership of Morris. Over the subsequent 6 months, they widened the ventilation ducts beneath their sinks using discarded saw blades found on the prison grounds, as well as metal spoons from the mess hall and an electrical drill improvised with a motor from a vacuum cleaner. The men concealed their work with painted cardboard and masked the noise with Morris's accordion, on top of an ambient din of music hour. Quite genius if you ask me. It took some time before the holes were wide enough to pass through, but they did. The men accessed the unguarded utility corridor directly behind their cells. They climbed through the vacant top levels of the cell block, and they set up a clandestine workshop. Here, using over 50 raincoats, among other stolen and donated materials, they constructed life preservers, based on a design that Morris had found in the March 1962 issue of the Popular Mechanics, with the article, "Your Life Preserver, How Will It Behave If You Need It?" They also assembled a 6 by 14 foot rubber raft, the seams carefully stitched by hand and sealed with liquid plastic available in the shop. They used heat from the nearby steam pipes to seal it. Paddles were also improvised from plywood and screws. Finally, they climbed a ventilation shaft to the roof and removed the rivets holding a large fan in place. Obviously, the men would have spent a substantial amount of time outside of their cells constructing their appliances that they would use to escape. So how is it that prison guards were not suspicious? The reason they were not suspicious is because the 4 men had created dummies. They made heads out of paper mache, mixing soap, toothpaste and concrete dust as well as toilet paper, and giving them realistic appearances with paint from the maintenance shop and hair from the barbershop floor. They piled clothes and towels under the blankets of their bunks, and the dummy heads were positioned on the pillows. This gave the impression that all 4 men were sleeping, so therefore no one decided to check on them. On the night of June 11th of 1962, with all preparations in place, the men decided to go with their plan. West discovered that the cement he had used to reinforce crumbling concrete around his vent had hardened, narrowing the opening and fixing the grill in place. By the time he managed to remove the grill and re-widen the hole, the others had already left without him. Calling it a defeat at this point, West returned to his cell and went back to sleep. Once in the service corridor, Morris and the Anglins climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof. Guards reportedly heard a loud crash as they broke out of the shaft, but nothing further was heard and the source of the noise was not investigated. Hauling their makeshift gear with them, they descended 50 feet to the ground by sliding down a kitchen vent pipe, then climbed down 12 feet of barbed wire. At the northeast shoreline, near the power plant, a blind spot in the prison's network of searchlights and gun towers, they inflated their raft with a concertina, a free-reed musical instrument that they had stolen, and modified it to serve as the bellows. At some time after 10 p.m, investigators estimated they boarded the raft and launched it, departing towards their objective, Angel Island, 2 miles to the north. The 3 men had a bit of time on their side, because their ruse of using successful dummy heads had worked. The escape was not discovered until the morning of June 12th. Multiple military and law enforcement agencies conducted an extensive air, sea and land search over the next 10 days. On June 14th, a Coast Guard cutter picked up a paddle floating about 200 yards off the southern shore of Angel Island. On the same day, and in the same general location, workers on another boat found a wallet wrapped in plastic, complete with names, addresses, and photos of the Anglins' friends and relatives. On June 21st, shreds of raincoat material, believed to be the remnants of their raft, were found on the beach not far from the Golden Gate Bridge. The following day, a prison boat picked up the deflated life jackets made from the same material 50 yards off of Alcatraz Island. According to the final FBI report, no other physical evidence was ever found. It was surmised by the FBI agents that all 3 men had drowned. They cited the fact that the individuals' personal effects were the only belongings they had, and the men would have drowned before leaving them behind. However, no human remains were found at the time. On July 17th, a month after the escape, a Norwegian ship spotted a body floating in the ocean. The ship did not retrieve the body and did not report the sighting until that October. The San Francisco County Coroner Henry Turkle cast doubt on speculation that it could have been one of the escapees, emphasizing the impossibility that the body was still floating on the surface after a month of being on the ocean. Instead, Turkle proposed that the corpse had been that of Cecil Philip Herman, a 34-year-old unemployed baker who had jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge 5 days earlier. Several coroners from neighbouring counties challenged Turkle's opinion, stating that it was possible the remains belonged to one of the escapees. But again, without a body there to prove who it was, nobody had any answers. FBI investigators announced their official position. While it was theoretically possible for the men to have reached Angel Island, the odds of them having survived the turbulent currents and the frigid waters of the bay were negligible. According to the final FBI report, West said that they had planned to steal clothes and cars upon reaching land, but no such thefts were reported in the immediate area. As West was the only conspirator not to participate in the actual escape, he fully cooperated with the investigation and was therefore not charged for his role. West was transferred to McNeil Island in Washington after Alcatraz was deactivated in 1963, and later back to Atlanta Penitentiary. After serving his sentence, followed by 2 additional sentences in Georgia and Florida, he was released in 1967, only to be arrested again in Florida the following year on a charge of grand larceny. At Florida State Prison, he fatally stabbed another inmate in October of 1972 in what has been deemed a racist hate crime. He was served multiple sentences, including life imprisonment on the murder conviction. He would later go on to die in 1978. On December 16th of 1962, another Alcatraz inmate, John Paul Scott, made water wings from inflatable rubber gloves and swam a distance of 2.7 nautical miles from Alcatraz to Fort Point, at the southern end of the Golden Gate Bridge. He was found there by teenagers, suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion, but he was not dead. After recovering in Letterman Army Hospital, he was immediately returned to Alcatraz. Scott is the only documented case of an Alcatraz inmate reaching the shore by swimming. Today, a multitude of athletes swim the same Alcatraz to Fort Point route as part of a 2-annual triathlon event. Because Alcatraz costs more to operate than other prisons, and because 50 years of saltwater saturation had severely eroded at the buildings, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy ordered the facility to be closed on March 21st of 1963. The FBI eventually closed its file on December 31st of 1979, after a 17-year investigation. Their findings dubbed that the prisoners must most likely have drowned in the cold waters of the bay while attempting to reach Angel Island. They cited the remnants found at the raft, as well as the personal effects of the men, as evidence. They stated that when the raft broke up and sank at some point, all 3 convicts succumbed to hypothermia, with their bodies swept away out to sea by the rapid current of the San Francisco Bay. The FBI did hand their evidence over to the U.S. Marshals Service, whose investigation remains open. As Deputy U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke told NPR, there's an active warrant and the Marshal Service does not give up looking for people. In 2009, Dyke said that he was still receiving leads on a regular basis. Their warrant will expire in 2030, when all the missing men will be at least 100 years old. In January of 1965, the FBI investigated a rumour that Clarence Anglin was living in Brazil. Agents were dispatched to South America, but found no direct evidence that he was there. A man called the Bureau in 1967, claiming to have been Morris's classmate and have known him for 30 years. He said that he bumped into him in Maryland and described him as having a small beard and mustache, but refused to give any further details. Family members of the Anglin brothers occasionally received postcards and messages over the years. Most were unsigned. One was signed Jerry and another Jerry and Joe. They also received a Christmas card, received in the family mailbox in 1962, saying, "To Mother from John, Merry Christmas." Another of the Anglin's 11 siblings, Robert, also said that sometimes the phone would ring and that all that could be heard was breathing on the other end. Robert said, "I suppose all that could be are pranks, but maybe it was my brothers." The mother of the Anglin brothers received flowers anonymously every Mother's Day until her death in 1973. and reportedly 2 very tall, unusual women in heavy makeup were reported to have attended her funeral. Could this very well be the Anglin brothers in disguise? Federal officials say that in the mid to late 1960s and into the 1970s, there were 6 or 7 sightings reported of the Anglin brothers, all in North Florida or Georgia. Robert said that in 1989, when the father of the Anglin brothers died, 2 strangers in beards showed up at the funeral home. According to Robert, they stood in front of the casket looking at the body for a few minutes. They wept and then they walked out. Could this also be another sighting of the Anglin brothers, coming to pay their respects to their deceased father, but of course not being allowed to let anybody know that it was really them? In 1989, a woman who identified herself as only Kathy called the Unsolved Mysteries tip line. She reported a photo of Clarence Anglin, and she believed it matched the description of a man who lived on a farm near Marianna, Florida. Another woman also recognized a photo of Clarence Anglin and said he lived near Marianna. She correctly identified his eye color, height, and other physical features. Another witness claimed that a sketch of Frank Morris bore a striking resemblance to a man that she had also seen in the same area. Is it possible that all 3 men stuck around the same area together? A day after the escape, a man claiming to be John Anglin called a lawyer called Eugenia McGowan in San Francisco to arrange a meeting with the U.S. Marshal's office. When McGowan refused this request, the caller terminated the phone call. Robert Cecchi, a San Francisco police officer, said that at 1 a.m. on the morning of June 12th, he saw an illegal boat off the bay near Alcatraz. A few minutes later, the boat left, heading under the Golden Gate Bridge. This led to the speculation that the prisoners might have enlisted outside Confederates to pick them up. The FBI dismissed Cecchi's accounts out of hand. In 1993, a former Alcatraz inmate named Thomas Kent told America's Most Wanted, a television program, that he had helped to plan the escape and claimed to have provided significant new leads to investigators. He said that Clarence Anglin's girlfriend had agreed to meet the men on the shore and drive them to Mexico. He declined to participate in the actual escape, however. He said he did this because he could not swim. Despite this, officials were skeptical of Kent's account because he had been paid $2,000 for the interview. A man named John Leroy Kelly dictated an extended deathbed confession to his nurse in 1993. Kelly claimed that he and a partner picked up Morris and the Anglins in a boat and transported them to Seattle in the Washington area. Later, under the guise of transporting them to Canada, Kelly and his partner murdered the escapees to get $40,000 from their families. At a location in Seattle where Kelly claimed the 3 escapees were buried, no human remains were found. In 2003, an episode of Mythbusters was aired. It tested the feasibility of the escape from the island aboard a raft constructed with the same materials and tools available to the inmates. After conducting their investigation, they concluded that it was in fact possible. In 2011, a documentary on the National Geographic Channel entitled Vanished from Alcatraz reported that contrary to the official FBI report, a raft was discovered on Angel Island on June 12 in 1962, just 1 day after the escape. It was also reported that footprints were found leading away from it. Furthermore, a 1955 blue Chevrolet was reported stolen in Marin County on the same day, a claim corroborated by multiple stories in the Humboldt Times and the San Francisco Examiner. The following day, a motorist in Stockton, California, just 80 miles away east of San Francisco, reported to the California Highway Patrol that he had been forced off the road by 3 men in a blue Chevrolet. In the same year, an 89-year-old man named Bud Morris, who claimed to be the cousin of Frank Morris, said that on 8 or 9 occasions prior to the escape, he delivered envelopes of money to the Alcatraz guards, presumably as bribes. He further claimed to have met his cousin face to face in a San Diego park shortly after the escape. His daughter, who was 8 or 9 years old at the time, said she was present at the meeting with Dad's friend Frank, but had no idea about the escape. In 2014, a study of the ocean currents was conducted by scientists at the Delft University. They concluded that if the prisoners had left Alcatraz at 11:30 p.m. on June 11th, they could have made it to Horseshoe Bay, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and that any other debris would have floated in the direction of Angel Island. consistent with the paddle and the belongings that were actually found. If they left before or after that time, however, the tides and currents were such that their chances of survival would have been slim. In 2015, a documentary entitled Alcatraz: Search for the Truth presented further circumstantial evidence gathered over the years by the Anglin family. Kenneth and David Widner displayed Christmas cards containing the Anglins' handwriting and allegedly received by family members 3 years after the escape. While the handwriting was verified as the Anglins, none of the envelopes contained a postmark stamp, so experts could not determine when they had been delivered. The family cited a story from the family friend Fred Brizzi, who grew up with the brothers and claimed to have recognised them in Rio de Janeiro in 1975. They produced photographs, purportedly taken by Brizzi, including one of 2 men, who according to Brizzi were John and Clarence, standing next to a large termite mound. Other photos showed a Brazilian farm that Brizzi claimed was owned by the men. Forensic experts worked for the family confirmed that the photo was taken in 1975 and asserted the 2 men were more than likely the Anglins, although the age and the condition of the photo and the fact that both men were wearing sunglasses hindered efforts to make a definitive determination. Brizzi also presented an alternative escape theory. Rather than use the raft to cross the bay, he said they paddled around the island to the boat docks, where they had attached an electrical cord, which was reported missing from the dock the night of the escape. They then attached it to the rudder of the prison ferry that departed the island shortly after midnight and were towed behind it to the mainland. Art Roderick, a retired deputy US Marshal who had once heard the investigation and later worked with the Anglin family, called Brizzi's photograph of the 2 men absolutely the actionable lead we've had, but added it could still all be a nice story, which isn't true, or a photograph could be misdirection, aimed at steering the investigation away from the Anglins' actual whereabouts. Michael Dyke, the last deputy marshal assigned to the case, said Brizzi was a drug smuggler and a con man, and was suspicious of his account. Brizzi's widow said that she never heard him mention seeing the Anglin brothers in Rio, and that he was a con man and was prone to making up stories. An expert working for the US Marshal Service did not believe the photograph was legitimate. Dyke said measurements of the physical characteristics of the Anglin brothers indicate that they are not the men in the Brazil photo, but he acknowledged the difficulty to make a definitive determination and ruling it out as a valid lead. In January of 2020, an Irish creative agency of AI specialists used facial recognition techniques to conclude that the men in the photo were in fact John and Clarence Anglin. Robert Anglin reportedly told his family before his death in 2010 that he had been in contact with John and Clarence from 1963 until approximately 1987. Surviving family members, who said they have not heard of anything since Robert's last contact with his brother in 1987, announced plans to travel to Brazil to conduct a personal search. But Roderick cautioned that they could be arrested by Brazilian authorities because the Alcatraz escape remains an open Interpol case. In 2018, the FBI confirmed the existence of a letter. It was allegedly written by John Anglin and received by the San Francisco Police Department in 2013. The writer asserted that Frank Morris died in October of 2008 and was buried in Alexandria under a different name, and Clarence Anglin died in 2011. His purpose in writing the letter, he said, was to negotiate his surrender in exchange for medical treatment of his cancer. The letter's authenticity was deemed inconclusive. In 2019, investigative journalist Christoph Posnell corroborated much of the information released by the FBI and other sources, including the raft found on Angel Island. He quoted various reports mentioning a blue Chevrolet of the same description of the one stolen after the escape that was spotted in Oklahoma, Indiana, Ohio, and South Carolina, where 3 months after the escape, 3 men matching the escapee's description attempted to acquire a residence in the woods. With so much evidence and also so much inconclusive evidence, it is unclear as to whether or not Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin really survived. Truthfully, I would like to believe they did, and I would like to believe that they were these little farmers living in Brazil somewhere. But of course, I don't know. I hope one day we will know and have more evidence to confirm or deny what actually happened, but the likelihood of that happening is very, very slim. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for staying with us if you stayed all the way to the end. If you like this kind of content, this unsolved mystery content, then please let me know and leave a comment down below. I would love to know if you like this stuff, and I'd be happy to do more in the future. I actually really enjoy doing this kind of content because it leaves me guessing, but it also leaves me with a lot of unanswered questions, which, as entertaining as that is, can also be quite frustrating. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. So I will see you next time. Bye for now.